My son was being bullied for his stutter, and I was done watching him suffer in silence. When I marched into the bully's father's office, I expected to meet an uncaring parent. Instead, as I described the traumatic incident that caused Mason's speech problems, Dr. Curtis went pale. "My son was there too," he whispered. "He's the other witness." Before we dive into this incredible story, I'd love to know, what was your favorite childhood game? Drop it in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more amazing stories every day. Now let me take you back to the day I decided to fight for my son. The phone call came at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I knew before I even answered that it was about Mason. The school had been calling me at least twice a week for the past 3 months, always with the same apologetic tone, always with another incident to report. "Mrs. Parker, this is Principal Williams at Jefferson Middle School. I'm afraid we've had another situation with Mason." I closed my eyes and leaned back in my desk chair at the insurance office where I worked as a claims adjuster. What happened this time? Mason was found hiding in the janitor's closet during lunch. When we asked him why, he said some students were making fun of the way he talks. We've spoken to the students involved, but I thought you should know. Making fun of the way he talks? Such a gentle way to describe the daily torture my 12-year-old son endured because of his stutter. Mason had developed the speech impediment 6 months ago, seemingly overnight, and it had transformed my confident, outgoing boy into a shadow of himself. "Was it Hugh Curtis again?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Principal Williams hesitated. "Mrs. Parker, we've discussed this before. While Hugh may have been involved, we can't single out individual students without concrete proof." "He's been tormenting my son for months," I interrupted, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Mason comes home in tears almost every day. He's stopped eating lunch because he's afraid to go to the cafeteria. He won't raise his hand in class anymore. This has to stop." "We're doing everything we can within our disciplinary guidelines." "Your guidelines aren't working. My son is suffering, and you're more concerned about protecting the bully than the victim." After I hung up, I sat in my cubicle staring at the stack of insurance claims on my desk, but all I could think about was Mason. 6 months ago, he'd been a normal, happy 6th grader. He played soccer, had friends over for sleepovers, and never stopped talking about his latest video game discoveries or the books he was reading. Then, one morning in early September, he'd woken up and couldn't get through a sentence without stumbling over his words. At first, I thought he was just tired or nervous about something at school, but as days turned into weeks, the stutter became more pronounced, more persistent. I'd taken him to our pediatrician, who referred us to a speech therapist, who referred us to a neurologist. Test after test came back normal. There was nothing physically wrong with Mason's speech mechanisms, nothing neurologically abnormal. The consensus was that the stutter was likely psychological, caused by stress, anxiety, or trauma. But Mason insisted nothing had happened. No major changes at home, no problems with friends, no academic struggles. He seemed as confused by his sudden speech difficulties as everyone else. The bullying had started softly and evolved as the months passed. Middle school students can be cruel under the best circumstances, but a speech impediment made Mason an easy target. At first, it was just snickering when he tried to answer questions in class. Then came the mimicking, the deliberate imitations of his stutter that sent him fleeing to the bathroom in tears. Hugh Curtis was the ringleader. 12 years old, popular, athletic, and apparently lacking any sense of empathy. He'd turned tormenting Mason into a daily entertainment, gathering audiences for his cruel performances, teaching other students to join in the harassment. I'd tried working with the school, following their protocols, trusting their promises that they would handle the situation. But 6 months later, Nothing had changed, except that Mason was getting worse. His stutter was more severe, his confidence completely shattered, his grades dropping as he stopped participating in class to avoid speaking aloud. That evening, I found Mason in his room, supposedly doing homework, but actually just staring at his math book with tears streaming down his face. "Hey, buddy," I said, sitting on the edge of his bed. "Rough day?" He nodded without looking up. I hate school, Mom. I hate the way I talk. I hate everything." My heart broke a little more. "Mason, we've talked about this. The speech therapist says your stutter will get better with time and practice. You just need to be patient with yourself." "But why?" he asked, finally looking at me with eyes that seemed too old for his 12-year-old face. "Why can't I just talk normal, like I used to?" It was the same question he'd been asking for months, and I still didn't have an answer. The doctors had suggested that sometimes stutters develop in response to stress or trauma, but Mason insisted nothing traumatic had happened to him. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said, honestly, "but I know you're brave, and I know you're strong, and I know we're going to figure this out together." "Hugh called me a freak today, in front of the whole cafeteria. Everyone was laughing." That was it. I'd had enough of working within the system, enough of trusting the school to protect my son, enough of watching him suffer while his tormentor faced no real consequences. "Mason," I said, taking his hands in mine, "I want you to know that what Hugh is doing is not okay. It's not your fault, and it's not something you have to just endure. Sometimes adults have to step in and make things right." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to talk to Hugh's father." Mason's eyes widened with alarm. "Mom, no! That'll just make it worse." "No, baby, it won't, because I'm not going to let this continue." That night, after Mason was asleep, I did some research on Hugh Curtis's family. It didn't take long to find information. His father, Dr. Joseph Curtis, was a well-known child psychologist with a practice downtown. He specialized in behavioral issues and trauma therapy for adolescents. The irony wasn't lost on me. The father of the child who was psychologically tormenting my son was a professional who supposedly helped children with psychological problems. I found Dr. Curtis's office address and phone number, but I decided against calling ahead. I wanted to see his reaction when I showed up unannounced, when he couldn't prepare his responses or deflect with professional jargon. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove downtown to Dr. Curtis's office. It was in a modern building near the medical district, the kind of place that screamed expensive and exclusive. The waiting room was decorated in soothing blues and greens, with comfortable chairs and children's books scattered on low tables. "I'd like to speak with Dr. Curtis," I told the receptionist, a young woman with a kind smile and concerned eyes. "Do you have an appointment? I could schedule you for—" "This is about his son," I said firmly. "It's urgent." Something in my tone must have convinced her, because she picked up the phone and spoke quietly to someone on the other end. A few minutes later, a man emerged from an office down the hall. Dr. Joseph Curtis was not what I'd expected. I'd imagined someone cold, distant, perhaps arrogant, the kind of person who would raise a child capable of such cruelty. Instead, he appeared to be in his early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who spent his days listening to other people's problems. "Mrs.?" he said, approaching with a cautious but professional smile. "Parker. Bonnie Parker. My son is Mason Parker." I watched his face carefully, looking for recognition, for guilt, for any sign that he knew why I was there. Instead, I saw only polite confusion. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Parker, but I don't believe I know your son. Is he a patient of mine?" "No." I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. But he should be, because your son Hugh has been psychologically torturing him for months. Dr. Curtis's expression shifted from confusion to concern. I think there might be some misunderstanding. Perhaps we should talk in my office. He led me down the hall to a spacious room lined with bookshelves and decorated with the same soothing color scheme as the waiting room. 2 comfortable chairs faced each other near a window that looked out over the city. Please, sit down, Dr. Curtis said, settling into one of the chairs. Now, can you tell me what this is about? Your son, Hugh, has been bullying my son Mason at Jefferson Middle School. Every day for the past 6 months, Hugh has been tormenting Mason about his stutter, making fun of him, encouraging other students to join in. The school won't do anything meaningful to stop it, so I'm here to talk to you directly. Dr. Curtis's frown shifted from confusion to concern. Mrs. Parker, I'm very sorry to hear that your son is having difficulties at school. Bullying is a serious issue, and if Hugh is involved in inappropriate behavior, I want to address it immediately. But I have to say, this doesn't sound like the Hugh I know. Really? Because the Hugh I know is a cruel, manipulative child who seems to take pleasure in making other children suffer. Mrs. Parker, I understand you're upset, and rightfully so if your son is being mistreated. But Hugh has never shown aggressive or bullying behavior before. In fact, he's been quite withdrawn lately, almost troubled. Troubled? I laughed bitterly. The only thing troubling Hugh is that he hasn't found new ways to humiliate my son. Dr. Curtis was quiet for a moment, studying my face with the kind of professional attention I imagined he gave his patients. Can you tell me more about your son's stutter? When did it develop? About 6 months ago, seemingly overnight. One day he was fine, the next day he could barely get through a sentence, and the doctors haven't found a physical cause? No. They think it's psychological, stress or trauma, they said, but Mason insists nothing happened to cause it. Sometimes children don't recognize traumatic events as traumatic, or they may not want to talk about something that frightened or upset them. Has Mason mentioned witnessing anything disturbing? An accident, perhaps, or violence of some kind? I shook my head. We've asked him dozens of times. He says he doesn't remember anything scary happening. Dr. Curtis leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Mrs. Parker, can you tell me exactly when Mason's stutter began? The specific date, if you remember it? September 15th, I said immediately. I remember because it was the day after his soccer game. He'd played great the day before, scored 2 goals, was talking nonstop about it at dinner. Then he woke up the next morning and could barely say his own name. I watched Dr. Curtis's face as I spoke, and I saw something change in his expression. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, or concern. September 15th, he repeated slowly. And you said this happened overnight? No gradual development? Completely sudden, like someone had flipped a switch. Dr. Curtis was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window with a troubled expression. When he looked back at me, there was something different in his eyes, a kind of dawning realization that made my stomach clench with anxiety. Mrs. Parker, can you tell me where Mason was on September 14th? After his soccer game, I mean. Do you remember his activities that evening? He went to get ice cream with his friend Tyler and Tyler's mom. They were celebrating the win. Why? Do you know where they went for ice cream? I frowned, trying to remember. That new place on 5th Street, I think. Scoops and More. It's near the intersection with Maple Avenue. Dr. Curtis went very still. 5th and Maple? Yes. Why? What does this have to do with Hugh bullying Mason? Instead of answering, Dr. Curtis stood up and walked to his desk, pulling out a calendar and flipping back several months. He stared at a particular date for a long time before looking back at me. "Mrs. Parker, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. On September 14th, in the evening, near 5th and Maple, did Mason witness anything unusual, anything that might have frightened him?" "I told you," he says, "nothing happened." "Please," Dr. Curtis interrupted, his voice urgent now. "Think. Did he come home upset that night, quiet, different in any way?" I closed my eyes, trying to remember that evening 6 months ago. Mason had come home from ice cream around 8 o'clock. Tyler's mom had dropped him off, and he'd seemed... Actually, now that I thought about it, he had seemed quiet, subdued. I assumed he was just tired from the game and the excitement of celebrating. "He was quiet," I said slowly, "but I thought he was just tired." "Did he say anything about what happened while they were out?" "Just that they'd gotten ice cream and..." "Actually, he did mention something about police cars. He said there were a lot of police cars and ambulances near the ice cream shop, but Tyler's mom had hurried them away before they could see what was happening." Dr. Curtis sank back into his chair, his face pale. "Oh my God. What is it?" "Mrs. Parker," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think I know what happened to Mason, and I think I know why Hugh has been acting out." "I don't understand." Dr. Curtis leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "On September 14th, at approximately 7:30 p.m., there was a violent carjacking at the intersection of 5th and Maple. An elderly man was dragged from his car and beaten severely. He died from his injuries 3 days later." I felt the blood drain from my face. "You think Mason saw this?" "I think Mason saw this, Mrs. Parker. And Mrs. Parker, I think Hugh saw it too." The room seemed to spin around me. "What do you mean?"
Hugh was also in that area that evening. He'd been at a friend's house nearby, and he was walking home when it happened. He came home that night completely shaken, but when I asked him what was wrong, he said nothing had happened. He's never spoken about it since. But that would mean that both boys witnessed the same traumatic event, Dr. Curtis finished, and that the trauma has manifested differently in each child. Mason developed a stutter, his mind's way of protecting him from having to talk about what he saw. Hugh became aggressive and angry, his way of dealing with feelings of helplessness and fear. I stared at him in shock. Hugh has been bullying Mason because they both saw the same horrible thing? It's possible that Hugh recognizes something in Mason, even if he doesn't consciously understand what it is. Sometimes children who've experienced trauma together can trigger each other's symptoms without realizing why. But why would Hugh target Mason specifically if they both went through the same thing? Because Mason's stutter is a visible reminder of that night. Every time Hugh hears Mason struggle with his words, it might be triggering his own memories of feeling helpless and afraid. His bullying could be his way of trying to control those feelings, to feel powerful instead of powerless. I had no idea. At home, he's more quiet, sad, but at school, he needs to show he has some kind of power. Dr. Curtis stood up and walked to his bookshelf, pulling out a thick file. "Mrs. Parker, I want to show you something. These are my notes from Hugh's sessions over the past few months. I've been treating him for what I thought was general anxiety and behavioral issues, but now..." He opened the file and showed me pages of notes, sketches, and observations. I couldn't understand most of the clinical language, but I could see patterns, references to nightmares, drawings of cars and people, mentions of anger and fear. Hugh has been having nightmares about cars. He's drawn pictures of people lying on the ground. He's talked about feeling angry all the time but not knowing why. I thought these were just typical adolescent adjustment issues, but now I see they're all connected to that night. "What do we do?" I asked. "How do we help them?" Dr. Curtis closed the file and looked at me with an expression that was both professional and deeply personal. "We help them together. Both boys need to process what they witnessed, and I believe they can help each other heal." You want them to have therapy together? But Hugh has been tormenting Mason for months. Mason is terrified of him. I understand your concern, Mrs. Parker. But consider this. Both boys have been carrying this trauma alone, thinking they're the only ones who saw what happened. Imagine the relief Mason might feel knowing he's not alone, that someone else understands what he went through, and imagine how Hugh might react when he realizes that his victim is actually someone who shares his deepest fear. I shook my head, still struggling to process everything I'd learned. This is all so much to take in. 6 months ago, my son was a normal, happy kid. Now you're telling me he witnessed a murder and has been suffering in silence ever since? Not just suffering in silence, suffering alone. But he doesn't have to be alone anymore. What exactly are you proposing? I'd like to arrange a joint session with both boys in a controlled, safe environment where they can begin to talk about what they saw. I think once Hugh understands the connection between him and Mason, his aggressive behavior will stop. And once Mason realizes he's not the only one who carries these memories, his healing can begin.
I thought about Mason, hiding in janitor's closets, crying over his homework, asking why he couldn't talk normally anymore. Then I thought about Hugh, apparently dealing with his own nightmares and anger, lashing out at the one person who might actually understand what he was going through. Would this really work? I asked. I've seen it work before. Trauma shared is often trauma halved. When children realize they're not alone in their experiences, it can be incredibly healing. But what if Hugh continues to be aggressive? What if seeing Mason just makes him angrier? Dr. Curtis was quiet for a moment, considering my question. Mrs. Parker, I need to be honest with you about something. Hugh's behavior toward Mason isn't just random bullying. I think on some unconscious level, Hugh recognizes Mason as a fellow witness. The bullying might be his way of trying to silence the reminder of that night. That's terrifying. It is, but it's also hopeful, because it means that once we address the root cause, the bullying should stop. Hugh isn't inherently cruel. He's a traumatized child acting out his pain. I looked around Dr. Curtis's office, at the diplomas on the wall, the books about child psychology, the comfortable chairs designed to make troubled children feel safe. This man had dedicated his career to helping children heal from trauma, and now he was discovering that his own son was one of those children. How did you not know? I asked. You're a child psychologist. How did you not recognize that Hugh had witnessed something traumatic? Dr. Curtis's face crumbled slightly. Because he's my father first and a therapist second. When your own child is hurting, it's harder to see clearly. Hugh has been very good at hiding his pain, just like Mason has. And because you never connected his behavioral changes to a specific event. Exactly. I knew something was wrong, but I was looking for typical adolescent issues, problems at school, social pressures, family stress. I never thought to ask if he'd witnessed violence. So what happens now? Now we help both boys heal. But Mrs. Parker, I need you to understand something important. This process might be difficult. When children finally talk about traumatic events they've been suppressing, it can get worse before it gets better. Worse how? Mason's stutter might temporarily increase as he processes his memories. He might have nightmares, anxiety, emotional outbursts. Hugh might also regress before he improves, but with proper support and therapy, both boys can recover. I thought about Mason's question from the night before. Why can't I just talk normal like I used to? Now I finally had an answer, even if it wasn't the answer I'd wanted. When would you want to do this joint session? As soon as possible. The longer both boys carry this alone, the more entrenched their symptoms become. But first, I need to talk to Hugh to prepare him for what we're going to discuss. And I need to talk to Mason. He's going to be terrified when I tell him he has to face his bully. Mrs. Parker, Dr. Curtis said, standing up and extending his hand, I want you to know how sorry I am. Sorry that both our sons have been suffering, sorry about the way Hugh's been treating Mason. Sorry that Hugh's pain has caused Mason additional trauma. Sorry that it's taken me this long to understand what's been happening." I shook his hand, surprised by the genuine remorse in his voice. "You couldn't have known. But I should have. I should have asked better questions, looked deeper, connected the dots sooner. We both should have. I should have pushed harder when Mason said nothing had happened. I should have trusted my instincts." "We're going to fix this," Dr. Curtis said firmly. "Both of our boys are going to get through this, and they're going to be stronger for it." That evening, I sat Mason down for the most difficult conversation of my life. I told him about my meeting with Dr. Curtis, about the connection between his stutter and the night he'd gone for ice cream, about Hugh's own trauma, and how it had led to his bullying behavior. Mason listened in silence, his eyes growing wider with each revelation. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "I remember," he finally whispered. "I remember the man on the ground. I remember the blood. Tyler's mom made us look away, but I saw it." "Why didn't you tell me, sweetheart?" "Because it was scary, and because Tyler's mom said we shouldn't look it, that it would just give us nightmares." "Oh, Mason, you've been carrying this all by yourself for 6 months." "Hugh was there too?" "Yes. Dr. Curtis thinks Hugh saw the same thing you did, and that's why he's been acting out. He's scared and angry, just like you are, but he's been showing it differently." Mason was quiet again, processing this information. "Will talking about it make my stutter go away?" "Dr. Curtis thinks it will help. It might not happen right away, but he believes that once you and Hugh talk about what you saw, both of you will start to feel better." "I'm scared to talk to Hugh." "I know you are, but Dr. Curtis will be there, and so will I if you want me to be. And Mason, Hugh is probably just as scared to talk to you." 3 days later, we were back in Dr. Curtis's office, but this time Mason was with me. He sat close to my side, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for escape routes. Dr. Curtis had arranged the chairs in a small circle, creating an intimate but non-threatening environment. When Hugh arrived with his father, I got my first close look at Mason's tormentor. Hugh Curtis was smaller than I'd expected, with dark hair and serious eyes that seemed too old for his 12-year-old face. He looked nervous, almost fragile, nothing like the confident bully I'd imagined. When he saw Mason, his expression shifted to something that looked almost like recognition. "Hugh," Dr. Curtis said gently, "this is Mason's mother, Mrs. Parker." Hugh nodded but didn't speak. Mason pressed closer to my side. "Boys," Dr. Curtis continued, "I've asked you both here because I think you have something in common, something that happened a few months ago that you've both been thinking about but haven't talked about." Both boys remained silent, but I could see the tension in their postures. "Hugh, do you remember the evening of September 14th? You were walking home from Danny's house." Hugh's face went pale. "Dad, I don't want to talk about that." "And Mason, do you remember that same evening you were getting ice cream with Tyler?" Mason's stutter was immediately more pronounced. "I don't want to talk about it either." "I know you don't," Dr. Curtis said softly, "but I think you both need to, because you both saw something that night that no child should have to see, and you've both been carrying it alone." Hugh looked at Mason with surprise. "You were there?" Mason nodded, tears starting to form in his eyes. "At the ice cream place?" Hugh said suddenly, "I saw you. I remember now. I saw you and another kid running away with a lady. You were by the bus stop. You looked scared." Dr. Curtis leaned forward. "So you both remember seeing each other that night?" Both boys nodded.
And you both saw what happened to the man in the car? Hugh's voice was barely a whisper. He was bleeding. There was so much blood. The other men hurt him. They took his car and left him on the ground.
And how did that make you both feel? Scared, Hugh said immediately. Scared, Mason agreed. Dr. Curtis nodded. Those are normal reactions to witnessing violence. But instead of talking about those scary feelings, you've both been dealing with them in different ways. He looked at Mason. Mason, your mind decided that if talking was dangerous, if talking about what you saw might bring back those scary feelings, then talking itself became difficult. Then he looked at Hugh. And Hugh, your mind decided that if you felt powerless and scared that night, then you needed to feel powerful and in control. So you started acting aggressively, especially toward people who reminded you of how helpless you felt. Hugh's face flushed red. I didn't mean to be mean. Every time I heard you talk, it reminded me of that night. It made me feel scared again, and I didn't like feeling scared. So you made me feel scared instead? Hugh looked down at his hands. I guess so. I'm sorry. Dr. Curtis smiled. Hugh, that's a very mature realization. And Mason, how does it feel to know that Hugh wasn't being mean because there's something wrong with you, but because he was dealing with his own scary feelings? Mason thought for a moment. It makes me feel less bad about myself. And Hugh, how does it feel to know that Mason understands what you saw that night? That you're not the only one who has those memories? It makes me feel less alone, Hugh said quietly. Over the next hour, Dr. Curtis guided both boys through their memories of that night. It was difficult. Both children cried, both struggled with the emotions that came flooding back. But something remarkable happened as they talked. Mason's stutter, while still present, became less severe when he was talking to Hugh about their shared experience. And Hugh's aggressive posture softened as he realized that Mason wasn't a target to be dominated, but a fellow survivor who understood his pain. I have nightmares about it, Hugh admitted at one point. Me too. I dream about the blood. I dream about the sounds he made when they hit him. I dream about his car driving away without him. Dr. Curtis took notes throughout their conversation, occasionally asking gentle questions to help them process their emotions. By the end of the session, both boys looked exhausted, but somehow lighter. How do you both feel now? Dr. Curtis asked. Tired, but better, I think. I feel like someone who finally understands. Hugh, do you think you can stop being mean to Mason at school? Yeah, I want to stop. I didn't realize I was being mean because I was scared. And Mason, do you think you can forgive Hugh for how he's treated you? Mason looked at Hugh for a long moment. If he promises to stop. I promise. And Mason, I'm really sorry. I know I made school horrible for you. It's okay. I understand now. Dr. Curtis scheduled weekly sessions for both boys, sometimes together and sometimes individually. Over the following months, I watched both children heal in remarkable ways. Mason's stutter gradually improved as he learned to talk about his trauma instead of suppressing it. He started participating in class again, made new friends, and even rejoined the soccer team. Hugh's aggressive behavior disappeared almost entirely. He became protective of Mason at school, shutting down any attempts by other students to mock Mason's speech. The two boys, who had been locked in a cycle of trauma and retaliation, became unlikely friends.
6 months after that first joint therapy session, I received a call from Mason's speech therapist. Mrs. Parker, I have wonderful news.
Mason's stutter has improved so dramatically that I think we can reduce his sessions to once a month. He's made remarkable progress. That evening, Mason came home from school with a huge smile on his face. Mom, guess what happened today? I noticed that his stutter was barely noticeable. What happened, sweetheart? Hugh and I gave a presentation together in social studies class, and I only stuttered twice in the whole presentation. That's wonderful, Mason. How did it feel? It felt really good. That night, Dr. Curtis called to check in. How are things going at home? He asked. Better than I ever imagined possible, I said honestly. Mason is like a different child, happy, confident, talking freely, and from what I hear, Hugh has become one of his best friends. It's remarkable what can happen when children realize they're not alone in their trauma, Dr. Curtis said. Both boys have shown incredible resilience. Dr. Curtis, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think this would have resolved itself eventually if we hadn't figured out the connection? Honestly, I don't think so. Both boys were stuck in a cycle that was reinforcing their trauma responses. Mason's stutter was getting worse, and Hugh's aggression was escalating. Without intervention, I think both children would have carried these issues into adulthood. So, by confronting you about Hugh's bullying, I accidentally saved both our sons? You saved both our sons by refusing to accept that your child had to suffer in silence. You advocated for Mason when no one else would, and in doing so, you uncovered the truth that set both boys free. A year later, Mason's stutter had almost completely disappeared, emerging only occasionally when he was very tired or excited. Hugh had become one of the most empathetic children in their grade, often standing up for other students who were being bullied. Both boys had learned that trauma shared is trauma halved, that speaking about scary experiences takes away their power to hurt us, and that sometimes the people who seem like our enemies are actually fellow travelers on difficult journeys. And I had learned that sometimes the most important conversations happen when we're brave enough to confront uncomfortable truths, when we refuse to accept that our children have to suffer alone, and when we're willing to look beyond surface behaviors to understand the pain underneath. The silent witnesses had finally found their voices, and in doing so, they had found each other. An absolutely powerful story about trauma, healing, and the unexpected connections that can transform enemies into allies. What's your favorite color? Share it in the comments below. If this story of two boys finding healing through shared understanding moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories about the power of empathy and second chances. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.